Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm again here with Christoffer Døhlen from Norway, and we have decided to talk a little bit about Aristotle and Aristotle's view of the world and of human beings in particular. And so we will start a little bit by discussing Aristotle's distinction between potency and actuality. And we will use human beings as an example. So we will talk about this notion that Jung called the individuation process. So the process of becoming who you truly are, of unfolding your own personality and your own particular self in the world. Yes, so maybe what are your first associations with this, Christoffer?
Thank you very much, Amos. Right, so first of all, I might perhaps begin briefly by just stating that Aristotle's philosophy, which is what we're going to be talking about, was of course postulated by Aristotle himself, the very great ancient Greek philosopher. And then it was further developed and supported by several philosophers later after him. For instance, the great medieval thinker St. Thomas Aquinas. And you can say that after the Renaissance or the early modern era in the 1600s and the 1700s, Aristotelian notions got sort of ignored and criticized. But I would say that Aristotelian notions are very central to describe the world around us in a very coherent and logical manner. Okay, so we could start by understanding from an Aristotelian perspective change to understand act and potency. So basically, we can start by observing that in the world around us, there are instances of change, things changing in several ways. You might have a thing moving, for instance, a car moving from this place to another place, change of location, that might be called. You have other kinds of change, for instance, a tree first being a seed in the ground and then gradually growing to becoming a full tree that might bear fruit. That's change, and things increasing in size, decreasing in size, all sorts of chemical changes that happen all the time. So we see instances of changes. And then Aristotle is thinking about how should we understand change? How can something go from one condition to another condition? How can something not exist in the first place, but then start to exist? For instance, the tree that didn't exist thousands of years ago, but now you have a seed and then it grows into a tree. How can you explain all of these changes? It seems almost like things come out of existence out of nothing, but that seems very absurd. How can something come from nothing? That seems very impossible. So therefore, Aristotle thought that change can be understood as something having potential to become something else. So in other words, when you see change, you see a thing having a certain potential to change into another condition. And then as the change goes on, this potential or potency is becoming actualized. It turns into act. So for instance, a tree, which started out as a seed, you can say that the seed in a certain sense has the potential, the potency of becoming a tree. But gradually over time, that potency becomes actualized. It becomes something actual. So for Aristotle, change and act and potency, it's not things or conditions coming out of nowhere, of nothing whatsoever. Rather, it's something that exists as potency, exists potentially in a thing, and then the potency becomes actualized. So that's the idea of act and potency. Act, something being actually existing out there, and potency is something existing in a certain sense, but only as mere potential. So what do you think, Amos? Is this a nice general introduction?
Yes, I think it's a very good introduction for the potency and actuality. And I was just thinking that, of course, we see the same thing in a human being. So basically, even from the point of conception onward, a new human being exists, and it has a certain genetic code. And basically this human being now has the potency of becoming the adult that it might become if it doesn't die before then. And so in some sense we see that in an embryo or in a small child or in an adolescent, there is always the potency of becoming the full grown, fully developed adult human being. And so I think for me this is a very helpful way of looking at it. And in some sense then this process of individuation that Jung talks about is exactly this, that you have to bring this potency into actuality, and you have to do this through living your life. So living your life basically means to act and to decide in order to bring your potential, the potential you, that the best you that you can be, bring it into actuality. That's basically the good aim that you should follow in life. So what thoughts do you have on this, and maybe connect it to Aristotle's theory?
Right, yes. So I think that what you described, the human being and its development from conception and onwards, is a brilliant example of act and potency, because as I've shown, there are many instances of change all around us. And we see that is also true of us human beings. And we see from conception onwards to human beings, the human being has certain potentials to become a full-grown, responsible adult, but that potential becomes actualized over time. So, for instance, the small child, for instance, has the potency to talk English or Norwegian or whatever language that he's raised up with. He has that inherent potency. But as he grows up and learns that language by his parents or other people, this potency is reduced to act, to say that way. It is becoming actualized, so that he actually has that ability as an actuality, not just as a potentiality. And I think I also want to introduce, or I can introduce, different kinds of potentiality or potency. And that is the idea of active potency and passive potency. So if a thing has an active potency, that means that it has a certain capacity or power to do something, to cause certain effects, while passive potency is still, it is also a potency to do certain things, but that potency is dependent, utterly very dependent upon other things actualizing that. So when we're talking about human beings, we can say that a very small child has an active potency or an inherent power to speak, to grasp abstract objects in his intellect, to understand things around him, to read, to calculate in mathematics. He has that as an inherent power within him. And then that power becomes actualized over time when he is raised up and becoming educated and all that kind of stuff. So that's one thing I want to say. And another thing that is also relevant to active potency is the idea that we human beings have a certain substance, or we are a certain substance. That means that we as human beings have this fundamental reality of being human beings. We exist in a certain independent sense. We're not simply part of something greater that is called humanity, but we exist as individual organisms, or as Aristotle would say, rational animals, which is his definition of a human being in a sense. So we have this substance of being human, and that substance is there all the time from conception and onwards. So we are always human being. We have this substance, but this substance can be understood as a certain potency or potentiality, because that substance can take on different, what is called accidental forms. So while we have this human substance there all the time, all the way, that substance might, you could say, become manifest in different accidental forms. So I suppose we could say that, let's say you and I, we are both human beings, and we have the substance human being, which we exist as in a certain sense. But of course we are different. We have different height and size and hair color and all kinds of stuff, which we could say are accidental differences. We have this same substance, but the substance, which is a kind of potency, is actualized in different accidental forms. I think that's one way one can understand it. So yes, what do you think of this these remarks?
Yes, I think we are getting more into Aristotle's theory. So just to recapitulate, so we would say being a human being, that is the essential form. So if something, for Aristotle, that the essential form is to be a rational animal. So if something is a rational animal, then it is a part of this category that we call human being. And if something is not a rational animal, then it is not a human being. That's why this is the essential form. But then there are accidental forms, as you said, the hair color or the height or the job that you do. So I think this is also an important aspect of Aristotle's theory. Now, I was thinking about two things now. If you grow up as a human being to become an adult, then maybe let's start generally. There are, I think, different virtues that Aristotle describes, and these virtues basically describe the difference between doing it right or doing it wrong. So if you move from the potency to the actuality, to actually being an adult, a full developed human being, then you can either develop in a good way or into a good form where you would have the virtues, or you could develop into a bad form where you would not have these virtues. Do you think this is a correct characterization?
Yes, I suppose that could be true in a sense that, as you said, when it comes to virtue ethics, it's also very central to Aristotle. We have certain ways of being, and virtues in Aristotle's philosophy is understood as a quality of our soul. And it needs to be understood that in Aristotle's metaphysical viewpoint, the soul is something that we are composed of. We are composed of a soul and a body, and they are very intimately connected to each other. So it's not like you can sort of make them as two separate substances, as René Descartes did. Rather, they are two aspects of the human substance in a certain sense. And I think it's relevant here when I talk about virtue and good way and bad ways. I think it's relevant to bring out the idea of, or principle of, essence as very central here, because also central to Aristotle's philosophy is that things around us has a certain inherent essence, and an essence can be defined as that which makes the thing into the kind of thing it is. Because we see around the world that there are many, countless almost things that exist, but they are different from each other. And that can be explained, Aristotle thinks, as things having different essences. So we human beings, we have the essence of a human being, which, as Aristotle would say, is to be a rational animal. The essence of a tree is to have these kind of roots, these kind of leaves, and perhaps the capacity to bear fruit, etc., etc. And for Aristotle, we can have things belonging to the same essence, but this essence might be, in a sense, realized or made full in different degrees. So, for instance, human beings can be human at the same time. They are both the same human essence, but the one might lack a certain essential property that the other can have, but they are still both human beings. So, for instance, I think you briefly mentioned that you can have one person who doesn't have one leg. He only has one leg, and the other is lost because of some damage when he was born. Or people without arms. There exist people like that. And these people still have the same human essence or human nature as we do, but that essence, from that essence, it derives certain properties, such as having two arms, but some people might lack that essential properties, but that doesn't mean that the inherent essence isn't there. So we have to distinguish between essential properties and the essence itself. So the essential properties are flowing from essence. It is derived from essence, from the essential human being. But you might lack those of different reasons and still have the inherent essence. So that's important to keep that distinction. And that's also relevant to virtue ethics, because our human essence can be better or worse depending on how much we can actualize, or you can say make our essence become full, I suppose we could say. So a human being which have his essence in a fullest sense, or actualizes all its properties, is one who is very virtuous and has a very healthy body, etc., etc. And if you have a person who commit lots of vices and lacks certain virtues, Aristotle would say that he is a bad human being. And badness and goodness is understood as relation to essence. So if something is good, it manages to obey its nature or essence to the fullest degree. But if something is bad, it disobeys it and sort of lacks the things that an essence should have, or flow from essence. What do you think of this presentation?
Yes, I think this is an important point for understanding Aristotle, and it's also important to stress that for Aristotle, good and bad is not the same as how we tend to understand it here in our European culture as being good in the sense of what you should do in a moral sense, or evil in the sense of, but it's more in the sense, as you said, of how good or bad does something have its essence actualized. So every thing, every substance has a certain essence, because that's the kind of thing that it belongs to, or is, and then it has the potency to be this thing in actuality, but not every instance, every substance then manages to the same degree to actualize this potency. So Aristotle would say a knife has the essence of cutting. And so a good knife is a substance that cuts very well, whereas a bad knife doesn't cut well, it cuts badly. And so the same, or similarly, Aristotle would also see human beings. So a human being has an essence, and then a good human being is a substance that actualizes this essence in a very good or beautiful manner. And so this is basically what then the virtues describe. So each virtue describes, for some aspect of human behavior, it describes how this aspect is actualized in a good or beautiful manner. And so I think that yes, this essence, that's very important for the definition of becoming, or of actualizing oneself. And so my next thought or question was, man is a rational animal, and so at least some part of virtue would have to do with living according to rationality. But there are also, I think, there are quite a number of virtues like justice or courage or benevolence, or so how do these fit together with rationality? I was just wondering about that.
Yes, these are good and deep questions, one can say. Yes, so first of all, as you implied there, we see that in Aristotle's view, we can connect metaphysics and ethics through the idea of essence. And also another aspect, which I think we should bring about as well, is the idea of teleology, things having certain ends or goals or purposes, which also is connected to things' essence. And you might, for instance, say that a seed in the ground has the purpose or end goal of becoming a tree, And that explains why that thing is directed toward that end. That's why it's becoming that when it's actualized. And also it can also be said that the idea of act and potency itself, when you think about those aspects of reality, implies teleology as well. So for instance, a potency is directed toward a certain condition which it might be actualized to become. So for instance, the seed has the potency to become a tree. So that potency is directed toward treeness, or the tree that it sort of is directed toward becoming, and then that purpose of the potency is becoming actualized over time. So that's one way, because you could see that how teleology is in the world around us, also in the very concept of act and potency. So when it comes to us human beings, Aristotle recognizes that yes, we have a human essence, and it is morally good for us to do things that obey our essence, to fulfill all the things that our essence wants to have naturally and essentially, and which we require to flourish as human beings when it comes to our essence. And here I should also point out very briefly that when we talk about goodness in other things in nature, for instance, a good knife, as you mentioned, or a bad knife, morality isn't involved there, only goodness in a more general and broad sense, because knives and other material objects don't have free will. So it's meaningless to talk about morality when it comes to those. But we human beings, we have free will to do actions or choose between things. And we can choose to flourish based on our essence. Based on our free will, we can choose that. And therefore, morality, in Aristotle's view, is related, in a sense, I suppose, to the idea of choosing between having a good essence and a bad essence. That's why virtue ethics is very intimately connected to essence and free will. And also here comes teleology. We human beings have a certain end or purpose based on our nature, and it is our moral duty to fulfill that purpose. So as you mentioned, rationality is a very important part of that, because reason for Aristotle is our, you could say, means of directing our efforts and coordinating resources and doing things to fulfill our essence. To act in a rational manner is for Aristotle to use things, to organize resources, to use our efforts in a sense that makes us become virtuous, to flourish as human beings. So that's how Aristotle understands morality. So that's sort of the way you could understand virtue ethics. And of course, when it comes to what kind of moral goodness that we should engage in, here it is relevant to observe and understand and reflect upon what our human nature needs, what we essentially need. And one such aspect is a sort of a fellowship or a community to belong to, because as Aristotle said, and as we have been discussing earlier, human beings are social animals. We exist in societies and community, and in a more intimate sense in the family, which is very natural to us. It's based on human essence. It's not an artificial construct, but it's natural. And here we might involve things like property rights, or even justice, and perhaps a social justice. Now, of course, radical leftists understand social justice in a sense that we might not, but just the general idea of social justice can be understood in the sense that because we are social creatures and we have certain common goods that we enjoy, but we cannot enjoy them on our own. We need to be in a community to actualize those common goods. Therefore, it is, you could say, in a certain sense, necessary to have law and order, to have property rights, to have social justice, etc., so that those common goods or social goods can be actualized, which we have a moral duty to do because of our human essence. So I hope I explained how I understand the ideas there. Good.
Yes, I really like this explanation. I think it's very helpful. So I was just thinking that this brings us nicely to the next point, which is that Aristotle sees that human beings have different aspects or different parts of the soul, as he calls it. And so the most specific aspect of a human being is that it is a rational animal. But then there are more general aspects that also have to be fulfilled. For example, human beings are part of the animals, and so they also have some desires or necessities similar to all the other animals, like having food, having drink, having a certain body temperature. And since they are social animals, as you said, they also have certain desires or needs that come from being social, so living in a group. And I think you pointed out very well that this is where perhaps most of the other virtues come in, because human beings are actually very intensely social, so they almost never live alone by themselves. And so everything that they do, it has to do with interacting with other human beings, and therefore these actions have to be regulated in that manner, and that's where all the virtues come in. So yes, but I think this comes from the fact that human beings are not only rational animals, but they also have to fulfill all the criteria of just being an animal in general. Yes, so maybe one other question, or if you want to say something to this, or I would have another thought.
Yes, I can just be very brief to mention one thing which you sort of alluded to, and that's the distinction between genus and specific difference. So when we talk about essence, we can see the structure of an essence in a way that an essence has a general, more universal aspect, which it shares with many other things having different essences. And then it has a specific difference, which makes it a unique kind of essence. So as you explained, we human beings in the traditional Aristotelian sense are rational animals. Now, I might also point out that if you disagree with the definition of a human being as a rational animal, if you think that definition is incoherent or unsatisfactory, okay, you might believe that, but the idea of essence itself is still something that you can believe in, even though you might disagree with this specific definition. But I anyways think that the Aristotelian definition is a very good one. Okay, so when it comes to us being rational animals, our animality us being animals is the genus, it's the more general aspect of our essence, which we share with other animals. But our specific difference, which makes us unique apart from other animals, is our rationality, our ability to reason, to grasp abstract objects, free will, etc. So yes, I just wanted to briefly make that distinction. Yes.
Yes, I think that was a good clarification. So one thought that I had was, okay, so we have the more general animal desires, and then we have the desires that, or the essence that pertains to all humans, being a rational animal. But then we also have even more specific differences between human beings. So for example, I am a man and I am not a woman. So there is some part of my nature, or if I want to turn my potency into actuality through living my life, through acting, then my potency now is different from that of a woman, because I have a certain distinction there in my nature. And also, some people are, for example, very strong, very physically strong. Some people are very intelligent. Some people are maybe more aggressive, so they are drawn towards being fighters. Other people are very peaceful, so they are maybe drawn towards caring for others. So how does this fit into this whole discussion of actualizing your potency?
Right, yes. So it seems to me that you can understand a human being, but also this is a general principle of other things as well, but you might distinguish between the idea of matter and form. I can talk about that very briefly in general. So another aspect of Aristotelian thought is the idea of hylomorphism, the idea that things around us, or at least material objects, are composites of matter and form. So the matter is the thing of which the thing is made of, but then the form is the principle that organizes the matter into the thing that it is. So we could say that the matter is a kind of potency, and the form is a kind of act. Because matter, if you talk about prime matter, as Aristotle would say it, that is matter without any form whatsoever. It's just pure potentiality. It cannot possibly exist on its own, because whatever form matter takes has a certain essence or a certain kind of being, a certain kind of matter. Even elementary particles have a certain form because they have certain functions and tendencies, etc. So prime matter is a pure potency, it cannot exist in itself. But then yes, because of prime matter, you have this idea of substantial form, which is the idea that you can have prime matter that is pure matter alone to be organized into a certain substance. For instance, as human beings, we human beings have this, you could say, prime matter, which is organized into the substantial form of a human being, which makes us the human substance. But then there are further distinctions or categories of matter and form. So while you have prime matter and substantial form, you have secondary matter and accidental form. So there are many categories to remember here, but yes. So secondary matter is therefore matter which is based upon our substance as human beings, for instance, but can take further forms, accidental forms. Which you mentioned, for instance, I would say the difference between you and me, or you and your neighbor, or you and your wife, or a person and his brother. They have the same human substance, but they have this sort of secondary matter. That is, they are made of things which might be organized in different individual, unique human beings. And that accidental form is therefore that form which differentiates you and me, you and your neighbor, you and your father and mother, etc., etc. So that's the way I would sort of describe that phenomena, if you want to call it that.
Yes, very nice. So according to Aristotle, basically the fact of being a man or a woman, or of being very tall and strong, or very aggressive, or very caring, these would be accidental forms. So it doesn't change me having the human form, the human essence, but it just, these are basically just accidental differences between one human being and another. Like, for example, two stones have a different shape, but they are both stones. And so in that sense, it would also not have a very big ethical not a big ethical weight, whether you are a man or a woman, whether you perform this job or that job, because everybody can just perform his accidental function well, but the important virtues are actually concerned with performing the essential properties of being a human being well. So this is where the important things are, and then the accidental differences still there can be performed well or badly, but it's not important for the essence. So that brings me to an interesting question. So could I then be, according to Aristotle, or I have two questions. One is for example, a plumber or a housewife of the same moral worth as like an intelligent philosopher? And the second question would be, is a good plumber or a bad plumber, can they both be equally good human beings?
Yeah, that's a big question, you could say. So one remark I would make first of all is to say that Aristotle wouldn't necessarily believe in this idea of human dignity as a very, very dignified thing that we have, which you could say is a more of a Christian thing. The idea that we are made in the image of God makes our dignity very, very high. but Aristotle lived before the Christian era, and therefore he didn't have this same view of human dignity as Christians had. For instance, he supported a kind of slavery, to make that example. So I suppose Aristotle would say that in the era of social interaction between human beings, all human beings play a role in forming certain social or common goods. For instance, if we have this idea of a city-state, which was very dominant in Aristotle's time, because it lived in Athens, and there was this collection of city-states in all of Greece. In a city-state, you might have people having division of labor, people doing different tasks, being in different positions, like one being a teacher, one being a housewife, etc., or plumber in an ancient form. And he would say that all of them have an important value because all of them contribute to those common goods which all of the inhabitants enjoy. So I haven't checked out explicitly what Aristotle himself thought in his books, but I would speculate that he would believe something like that. So he wouldn't necessarily say that human beings have this dignity that is so high that you should even love your enemies, which is what Jesus Christ taught. For Aristotle, it would more be, you could say, a practical thing, that you should respect the property and lives and freedoms of other people, because that is a very important thing to flourish as a human being, and also to gain certain virtues, which is very important in your own life. So I suppose Aristotle would believe something like that.
Yes, I think this sounds plausible to me. I think it was very well of you to distinguish the notion of human dignity, which we kind of almost take for granted in our culture, but in Aristotle's cultural surrounding, this was not given, but this is a Christian idea. So, but still, and also I think that Aristotle says at some point that, as you said, all of these different parts of society contribute to the whole. And for Aristotle, the whole, the society or the polis, is more important than the individual. And so each member of the society that contributes to the self-sufficient existence of the society, because the society is the smallest unit that can exist in a state that is pleasant for each of its members, and that is self-sufficient, so that doesn't need any help from the outside. And in that sense, each member that contributes to this state is good, and in some sense is equally good or important, because you cannot have a polis or a society that consists only of philosophers, just as you cannot have a society that consists only of plumbers. So I think this is a good example, or a good answer to this question. And to the second question, I was also thinking that if you take this notion of the essential form, or the essential form and the accidental form, then somebody could be a good human being, even though if he is a bad plumber, for example, or a bad at his specific job, because he would still fulfill the essential criteria of being a human being, or the essential virtues. He could still fulfill them well, or at least if he could do that, then he would be a good human being. Now, of course, you can ask, if someone is bad at his specific job, then can he be, for example, just, or can he be, what's the right term, like giving money to those people who are in need? So, because maybe he will be an obstacle to other people, and other people will have to take care of him. And so then this would make him not a good human being. But it's more because he fails in the essential virtues, and not because he fails in his job. I think that would be maybe my answer to this problem. What do you think to that?
Well, first of all, one thought that I had is that I suppose it is at least theoretically possible that you might be a good human being, but say a bad plumber or a bad teacher or guardian. For instance, you might have situations where you have to do a bad job in order to obey a higher principle and a higher moral principle. You can sort of make some sort of hypothetical scenarios where, let's say, some person have you could say kidnapped your children, for instance, and you for some reason or another work as a plumber at his house without him knowing it, and you can sabotage his house in order so that he is injured so that you can go save your children. This is of course very, very hypothetical, but I suppose at least it isn't logically necessary that you have to be a good plumber to be a good human being. But in general, that is something that you're supposed to do because of the common goods that you contribute to when you are a plumber or a teacher. So when you are a good plumber or teacher or guardian, you are contributing well to society, which you yourself have an interest in, because society is important for your own flourishing. So that's sort of what I would say about that.
Yes, I think really probably the important aspects follow from the other virtues. So because if you are a virtuous person, then you would try your best to do your job well. I have just now I can't find the word that describes this virtue, but I'm sure that it somehow belongs to the general corpus of virtue. So somebody who would just do his job really badly and not care about the result, this wouldn't be a good person, because yes, as you said, you would, for example, fix somebody else's house poorly, but you would still take money for it, and so then it would be unjust. So I think through this route we can see that you should at least try your best to do your job well, and then over time you would also become a good plumber if you work at it every day for a couple of years. So, no, go ahead.
Oh yes, sorry. Yes, I was also thinking about one thing that I'm not quite sure how an Aristotelian would think about it, but perhaps something that Aristotelians can disagree with themselves about, is that you might perhaps argue that a human being, because of his essence, has a moral duty not only to further his own individual human goods, but human goods in general. So that you sort of might have a moral duty to do other human beings good, for instance, in a just relationship, where you do a good job in exchange for money. You don't do that solely because you want to have a good society which you can participate in and flourish in, but also because of your essence, you have a general duty to help other human goods flourish in general. I'm not quite sure if an Aristotelian has to believe that, but I have heard some sort of Aristotelian leaned people or philosophers believing some sort of thing about that. So that's just a remark I wanted to make. Yes. So
yes.
Go ahead.
I'm not sure about that either. Maybe we can just keep this as a side note. Maybe people can research it if they are interested. So for me now, there is one more big question open for this topic, and that's this. I heard this often, and I think there is something flawed in this criticism of Aristotle, but still I heard it often lately. So if you define human beings as rational animals, then there are some human beings who are either just not very well equipped mentally, or maybe they are even mentally handicapped. So these people would then never be able to actually live according to the principles of a rational animal, because their rationality is severely impaired. And so, but still we think that they are human beings. So how can we deal with this problem?
Right. Yeah. So I think it is relevant here to sort of distinguish between essence and properties which flow from essence, because it seems like some modern contemporary analytic philosophers believe that essence is simply a collection of certain properties which you would have in every possible world in this modal realism, which is a contemporary analytic philosophical idea. But from an Aristotelian point of view, it's important to understand that essence is something that is inherent to us, which is not identical to certain properties we have, but rather the properties exist because of that inherent essence. The properties, or the essential properties, flow from that essence. They derive from that. And that's why, in an Aristotelian sense, you could therefore have multiple human beings having the same human nature, but yet some people lack certain properties which essentially flow from that essence. For instance, a person lacking a leg or an arm, or things like that, or mentally handicapped, they still have this inherent essence, and therefore, because of that essence, they have the inherent potency or potentiality of having these essential properties, like having two legs, having two arms, and rational thought. They have that inherent capacity within themselves. But unfortunately, there is some external factor, some disease or genetic mutation or whatever, which is blocking those properties from flowing out. It's sort of like a very small amount of water, which is coming down from a mountain, from the top of the mountain, and just coming down alongside the mountain. You could sort of say that, okay, let's say, yeah, you have some beavers or human beings blocking this water from entering further down the mountain. You can say that that's an analogy to essential properties flowing from the essence, but being blocked in its full realization, in a sort of analogous sense to water, still coming from the top of the mountain, but it is sort of going down the mountain, and then it's being blocked along the mountain, but still it's water on the top of the mountain. So that's perhaps an analogy to this idea of essence and properties flowing from essence. So that's a very important Aristotelian notion. Yes.
Yes, I think there is really not much to add to this. That's absolutely, I think, a good answer to this objection that the human essence, or the essence of being a rational animal, is inherent in every substance or every individual that belongs to the species of being a human being. And through this inherent essence, they have the inherent potency of becoming a rational animal. But then there is some unfortunate external factor that hinders this potency from actualizing itself, from coming into actuality. And so that's why you have then a human being that has certain properties that flow from his essence, but these properties are only realized to a different degree in each human being. So not each human being is equally rational, or not each human being, as you said, has two legs or has maybe hair on his head, even though these are properties that are connected with being a human being.
Exactly, and one area of which such an understanding is relevant is the discussion about gender, which we have also talked about earlier, that, for instance, gender is an aspect of an individual human being, which have certain properties which flow from that gender, but it's not identical to it. And that's relevant to the transgender debate, for instance, about what makes a person have a certain gender. And it's not, technically, it's not to merely have a certain organ on your body, sexual organ. Rather, the sexual organ is intimately connected with the gender, but it's not identical to the gender. So you could, in principle, lack that organ, but still, let's say, the organ of a penis, but still be a male, or for women with their sexual organs. So that's relevant to that debate, for instance, and that's why Aristotelian notions make sense of how you can have people being people, human beings, but still having different degrees of property realizations, if you want to use that technical term. Yes.
Interesting. That's a nice outlook, maybe for our viewers to follow this idea further. That maybe let's just make it a little bit more concrete. So gender would then be an aspect of being a human being, like being either male or female. But this gender could be realized to a varying degree. Or maybe there could be something like some unfortunate external factor that interferes with the actualization, maybe even in the womb, with the actualization of this potency. And then it could happen that someone has maybe not the full realization of his gender, or maybe even some mix somewhere in between the two genders. But this would not be the norm, but it would actually be some sort of yes, like an unfortunate external factor that blocks the potentiality to come into actuality.
Exactly, and that's how you could, for instance, say that person who are born as intersex, i.e. people with gender properties which are hard to understand and interpret for certain scientists or generally people. It's still reasonable to say that they are either male or female, but due to unfortunate circumstances, genetic mutation, for instance, it is difficult because we find people's essence based on their properties, even though the essence is not the same as their properties. So in some circumstances, the properties might not be as explicit as they naturally should be, and therefore further scientific investigation might be necessary in certain extraordinary cases to find the true gender, the true essence, because the properties aren't always completely easy to interpret in certain extraordinary circumstances. And also that sort of answers it seems to be a critical objection to the idea of two genders, that we shouldn't judge the reality of gender based on regularities. That's simply because it's normally the case that males have these and these sexual organs, that therefore that is essential. But therefore that is the case that it should be, it's necessary. The problem is that these regularities can be very reasonably explained because of essence. There we have an explanation for why it's regular for people to have this and that and the other thing, and it seems to conform with what science and common sense discovers for us. So yes, that's how Aristotelian essences can be very relevant and very reasonable to modern day debates. And it seems to me that because many philosophers throughout the centuries have denied important Aristotelian notions such as essence or substance and accidents, that the consequences of denying those Aristotelian notions have been many bad philosophical ideas, which we might see today with all this existentialism of Sartre, for instance, or Michel Foucault, or this postmodernist idea which neglects the idea of truth, objective truth, or deconstruction, and all these radical ideas. You can sort of trace some of them, at least, back to the idea of denying important metaphysical notions. So I think it's very important for multiple reasons to have a sound metaphysical worldview like Aristotelians.
Yes, I would agree 100% to this statement. And I also think it's absolutely impractical and maybe even impossible to define most concepts without defining them by the regularities. So except from truly like chemical or physical property, like this is a carbon monoxide molecule, or this is a carbon atom, you could most concepts that we use, you couldn't define them. So you might say this is a horse, but then if somewhere some horse comes to the world that has only 3 legs because of some genetic defect, then you could no longer define what a horse is, because does it now have 3 or 4 legs? You obviously you have to get your definition from the regularities, from the way something normally is, and then you can define the things that deviate from the normal state as being a deviation from the normal state. Else you cannot have any category whatsoever, because how would you distinguish between a horse and a donkey or a cow or anything? So I think this is very important, and I think also, even if you accept, and I think I would accept, that there can be a case where through some very how do you say, something with very low probability happening, so that a person comes to the world and has maybe even contradicting properties. So they have some properties of being a man and some properties of being a woman. And you could say that we cannot define their gender as just being male or female. That doesn't change anything about the fact that for 99.9% of all human beings, we can perfectly well define their gender as being either male or female. And so I don't think that such special cases are anywhere a necessity to then destroy the categories that we generally use to describe the world and to talk. So I think that's just like an interesting little detour about how you could apply the Aristotelian worldview to the gender question.
Yes, exactly. And therefore you can see how, for instance, essence and essential properties make sense of regularities, instead of, as David Hume seems to believe, that, oh, it's simply random and arbitrary and unreasonable to believe in regularities, but rather we can understand it in a very reasonable framework when we understand essence and properties in that sense, etc. And also a related issue I would also perhaps I could mention is that the idea of the laws of nature, in a sense that David Hume are probably not laws of nature. For David Hume, it seems to be simply some regularities in nature which simply happen, and we have no reason to expect them to happen again. So they are mere regularities. But from an Aristotelian point of view, laws of nature, or these regularities, which this laws of nature is, according to David Hume, makes perfect sense to be understood as the way things operate because of their essence. They are basically descriptions of things acting based on its essence, at least in an ordinary way. And so we see it there as well, that you can have a very reasonable explanation of what the laws of nature is, regularities, etc. And it seems to be a very reasonable way of approaching the world, contrary to this very arbitrary, irrational philosophy of David Hume, if I may say so. So yes, that's very relevant. So yeah, what do you think? Should we sort of just have general conclusions about this conversation, or is there one topic you want to talk about further? Or
no, I think I would just like to agree with you that the Aristotelian worldview is a very reasonable worldview, and it coincides nicely with our common sense and with the way that we experience the world in everyday life, and the way that we actually also interact with the world in everyday life. So I think I would absolutely agree that there are many weird philosophical theories that might be internally consistent, but they are just very, very useless and just chaotic, and they don't help to understand the world or to live in the world or to act in the world. And so I would just like to agree to that. And for me, I think we have covered a lot of very interesting topics. We have kind of given an overview of the Aristotelian worldview and applied it to some examples, mostly to the human flourishing or becoming a fully developed individual or adult. but also some other more specific problems like the gender question or the natural laws. So yes, for me, I have nothing more to say. I would give you the last word, and then.
Yes, right. So as you said, we have been through many important Aristotelian principles, and I hope that the audience had learned a lot about this, because it's, I would argue, very relevant today to understand the world and have a very reasonable explanation for why things happen in the world around us as they do. And of course, there is much more to the Aristotelian or later Thomist or scholastic philosophical traditions than what we've been talking about. You could sort of talk in depth about more about perhaps substance or other things, or essence and existence, how we are to understand those. So I might also recommend some, at least two books about this general subject, if people are more interested in these topics. And one of them, which I have been enjoying, is called, it's not Aristotelian philosophy, but Thomist philosophy. But Thomist philosophy is very much linked to Aristotelian philosophy. So that's why I think that it's a good book. It's called Aquinas, A Beginner's Guide by Edward Facer, which is an American philosopher very good at arguing for Aristotelianism. If you want to go really in depth, I could recommend Scholastic Metaphysics, A Contemporary Introduction by the same author, Dr. Edward Facer. If you want to know more. Of course, there are many other books out there as well, but at least I can mention these two. So yes, I will end this by saying thank you very much, Amos, to have me on to talk about these subjects, and I wish you, as well as the audience, a great day and a great weekend.
Yes, thank you very much for coming on. It was very interesting, and I will see you in a week. So take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Great. Yes, goodbye.